の司会を担当する金戸マークザエリです。ただいまより鶴文化大学加藤ゼミ英文学会共催の特別講演会を始めさせていただきます。はじめに本日の講演をしてくださる講師の紹介をさせていただきます。加藤先生、お願いします。
今日は、6限の遅い時間にお集まりいただきありがとうございます。本日お迎えしておりますジョシュア・ロジャース先生を、私からご紹介させていただきます。ジョシュア先生にはですね、私が昨年、在外研究で、ニューヨークに行った時に、ニューヨーク市立大学の、中の、クイーンズカレッジで、客員研究員として所属させていただいて、お世話になりました。研究サポートしていただくだけでなくて、先生が、ジャパニーズシネマという事業を担当されていて、そして、アメリカ人の学生さんたちがみんな、私よりもずっと、映画に詳しくて日本の映画を、毎回週に2本ですね、皆さんが見てそれを議論する、その現場に立ち会って、すごく勉強させていただきました。さらに今日、この後ですね、青木さん、4年生の、ゼミ生の、方からですね、ご紹介いただきますけれども、ジョシュア先生のニューヨークの、授業と、私の加藤ゼミの、授業を、つなぐ、コイルプロジェクトといってですね、コラボレーティブ、オンラインインターナショナルラーニングという、形で、2つのクラスをつなぐ、そういう試みにして、それで、その体験をしていただいた、ゼミ生の皆さんに今日も、ここに来ていただいているという、ことです。ジョシュア先生はですね、日本文学の、ご専門でいらっしゃいますけれども、生まれ育ったのはテキサス、皆さんアメリカのテキサスイメージできるでしょうか。荒野とかなんでしょうね、ウエスタンな感じ、をイメージしていただけるかと思いますが、テキサスで最初、テックユニバーシティということですから工学部に、学ばれた、んですが、その後ですね、日本に奨学金を、日本の文科省の奨学金を得て、日本にいらっしゃいました。そして東京外大で日本語をまず学ばれた後、東京大学に入学されて、東京大学を2012年に終えられて、現代文芸論というですね、現代文芸論という東大の本郷の方にある学科というのはですね、そう入学する方が3つの言語をできないといけないって聞きますがどうですかっていう学科でもうインターナショナルな、研究をする、日本文学、だけではないあらゆる、文学を研究する中で、ジョシュア先生は日本文学を研究されました。そして、日本での、東大で学位を取られた後に、アメリカに戻られて、日本文学研究では一番の、メッカであります、コロンビア大学ニューヨークにあるんですけれども、そのニューヨークの、コロンビア大学で、博士号を、取得されました。それが2020年のことですね。まだまだお若い先生なので2020年に、取られて、それからポストドクとして研究を、続けられた後ですね、バッサ大学という、ところにまず特任、准教授として、着任されて、たんですけれども、このバッサ大学という大学は、皆さんこの7月から、発行された新しい日本のお札の、津田梅子5000円札、まだ私見てませんが皆さんいかがでしょう。津田梅子さんが、津田塾大学を作る前にアメリカに留学した、大学がこのバッサ大学という、セブンシスターズといってですね、アメリカで女性が通う大学の、名門があった中の一つで、今では1960年代に共学の大学になってますが、そのような歴史のある大学で、1年間教えられた後、今の、クイーンズカレッジの、准教授として日本文学映画を投じられています。ご専門についてはですね、これは大学のホームページ、からですね持ってきたんですが、非常に難解な、専門は、20世紀初頭の、日本の、作家たち、著名な作家たちが、その時代のですね、いろんな、科学と宗教と、迷信と、そういったさまざまな信仰、の、思想の中で、そういった言説と、どう日本文学の作品にが関わっているか、 そんなご研究をされていらっしゃいます。そして、最近でのご業績としてご案内できるのはこういった、著作なんですけれども、このそうですね、この、2つ最後の、論考のタイトルの中にも入っているように、柳、宗義、こういった、民芸運動の主導者、なんですけれども、美術評論家でもあり、宗教と、そうですね、文学と、の、哲学、横断的な、活動をした作家なんかも、ご研究の対象とされています。という、ジョシュア先生に今日はですね、たっぷり日本文学をそもそもですね、アメリカに生まれ育ってなんで興味を持たれたのかというあたりから何かお話を皆さんにしていただけるかなと、楽しみにしております。私からの紹介は以上です。
ありがとうございました。講演に先立ちまして、鶴文化大学加藤ゼミとニューヨーククイーンズカレッジの間で行われたコイルプロジェクトでの学びについて、青木瀬奈さん、よろしくお願いします。
はい、では、プロジェクターの調子も良くなってきたので、私から簡単ではありますが、コイルプロジェクトの報告をさせていただきます。私は先ほど紹介に預かりました、鶴文化大学文学部英文学科4年生で、加藤ゼミで、イギリス文学を研究している青木瀬奈と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。概要としましては、参加理由、主な活動、そして感想、まとめみたいな感じです。参加理由といたしましては、日本の終戦からおよそ80年が経っていますが、戦争の歴史や記憶、いわゆる後見者の方がいなくなってしまったりとか、実際に経験されてきた方が、どんどん軌跡に入られているということで、なかなかその記憶とかっていうものは薄れつつあります。しかし、世界では、第一次世界大戦と第二次世界大戦という激しい大きな戦争が行われて大きな被害を出したにもかかわらず、いまだに各地で紛争や対立が相次いでいます。そのような中、私たちが平和に対してできることは何だろうか。そして映画作品を通して日米双方、敵国同士であった学生同士で、その戦争というものをもう一度改めて考えてみることで、平和について考えることが今私たちにできることではないかということで、今回コイルプロジェクトに参加することになりました。主な活動です。まずは、日本時間の、2024年4月20日の私たちは朝の9時からで、クイーンズカレッジニューヨークの学生の皆さんは、4月19日の夜8時からですね、顔を合わせるということで Zoom を通して行いました。 そうですね、まずはお互いに話したこととしてましては、簡単な、自己紹介みたいなものはすでに出来上がっていたんですけれども、戦争に対するその考え方であったりとか、ステレオタイプですね、その各地の各国に対する先入観というものに対する危機感であったり、そういうものについてお互い話し合いました。特に戦争から考えられるエピソードに関しましては、世界史だと、他の敵国の事情については分かるけども、なかなか自国のそういう被害について知らないであったりとか、なかなか大きいところにフォーカスがいきがち、例えばナチスドイツであったりとか、そういったものにフォーカスはいくけど、他の被害のことについては全く知らないであったり、広島にすごくフォーカスされがちで、長崎はって聞かれるとちょっとよく分かんなかったりとか、その日に、原爆に対して祈ったら、あと他の日はじゃあ何してるのって言われると、あんまり戦争については考えないよねというようなところが出ました。またその後は最終発表のプレゼンテーションに向けてチーム内でどのように計画を練っていくかというところを検討した次第です。次に、まずは映画評論を行いました。4月22日には、映画「オッペンハイマー」、そして、4月29日には和尾石黒が原作の「浮世の画家」の鑑賞、2つの映画の鑑賞でそれぞれコメントを出しました。オッペンハイマーに対してはちょっと私自身面白い記事があったので紹介させていただくんですが、アメリカでオッペンハイマーが公開された時、観客の6割はなんと34歳以下、結構若い人がオッペンハイマーに興味を持っていました。クリストファー・ノーランという方がオッペンハイマーを作ったんですけれども、彼の前作の2017年に公開された映画「ダンケルク」に比べると若者の関心が非常に高まっていたことがあります。そのオッペンハイマーがすごく若者に興味を持たれた理由については、原爆を使っていて非常に興味があったというものが多くありました。アメリカでは結構戦争映画を作られることはよくあったんですけれども、原爆にフォーカスを当てたものがオッペンハイマーは初めてだったというところで興味があったということです。そして、その映画を機に軍事大国アメリカの醜い側面であったりとか、ソビエトへの言及というものがあったということもあって、そのアメリカの反戦体制だったりとか原爆に対する考えっていうのは徐々に変わってきているそうです。ちなみに2020年に6000人のアメリカ人を対象にして行った調査では、18歳から24歳の Z 世代と呼ばれる若い人々の 52% はアメリカは日本に謝罪すべきだという答えを出しています。一方で、謝罪すべきでない、別に原爆を落としても仕方なかったよねって言っていた 23% のおよそ大きく上回っている状況になります。そういった形でオッペンハイマーはアメリカ国内にもその反戦であったりとか原爆に対する考えを覆したというのではすごく大きい、ヒット作品というか興味深い作品になったのかなと思っています。また和尾石黒の浮世の画家については、プロパガンダ、戦意を超えさせるための絵画でしたりとか、そういう文言、そうです。例えば勝つまでは文句言いませんとか、そういう感じのものであったりとか、あと戦争が科学や芸術に及ぼす影響、そしてそこから生まれる人間の苦悩や社会の脆さ、矛盾っていうものを学んで、平和の概念や戦争をしてはいけない理由というものを改めて日米双方の学生で考えて確認し合うことができました。次にプレゼンテーションの作成です。これはプレゼンテーションの主な一例なんですけれども、さまざまなそうですね、戦争に関する要素を取り入れた映画作品というものを取り上げました。例えばここに書いてある通り、戦場のメリークリスマスとかではその日米両軍のその思いとかそういったところであったりとか、風立ちぬやジパングでは、日本が戦争に対してどのように向き合っていったかというもので、ゴジラに関しては核でしたりとか、裸足の弦や黒い雨という作品では原爆、そして他にも蛍の墓やこの世界の片隅にでは市民との戦争であったりとか、さまざまな、ところにフォーカスを当てて戦争というものについて深く映画作品を通して研究することができたと考えています。プレゼンテーションの構成といたしましては、作品の概要、歴史的背景、そしてその作品が持つメッセージ性やその映画が取り上げた内容をですね、現実社会でどのような影響を与えたかについて研究いたしました。扱った内容はこのようにさまざまなものでした。 こういうプレゼンテーションを通して私たちは戦争のあらゆる要素を題材として取り上げることでですね、数多くの知見や戦争観、また作品が持つメッセージ性などを読み取ることができ、その上でやはり戦争は良くないだったりとか、平和について改めて考えなければならないよねというところを再認識することができたなと感じています。感想です。感想では、戦争という題材は若い世代の間ではなかなか触れる機会がなかったので、同世代のさらには敵国同士であった学生と議論し合うことで戦争への認識や視点の違いが分かり、非常に有意義であった。またこのような機会はめったにないので非常に貴重であり刺激になったとの感想がありました。私自身実際にこのコイルプロジェクトで戦争映画を見るまでは戦争映画の名前は知ってたけど見たことがないものがたくさんあったんですね。特に黒い雨は国語の作品では、こういう作品がありますよと言われてましたけども、映画があったことすら知らないでしたし、知らなかったことも多かったですし、あと他の人の研究プレゼンテーションから映画の要素というものを確認することができたなと思っています。こういった機会がないと私たちは全然戦争についても知らないし、言ってしまえば平和ボケのようなそういった状況が続いてしまうのではないかと思うと、こうやって自ら、探求して学ぶことの重要性というものを改めて感じることができたと思いますし、今後も戦争であったりとか紛争とかさまざまなことが起きてますけども、そういったことに目を背けないで自分から勉強していくことで、世界に対して理解を深めたりとか平和について改めて今後も考えていきたいなと考えています。私の発表は以上です。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。それではジョシュア・ロジャーズ先生による Fiction Across Borders Learning from Literature in Japan and the US 国境を越えるフィクション日米の文学から学ぶの講演を始めさせていただきます。ジョシュア先生、よろしくお願いします。
Okay, so I'll get started. First of all, I just want to say thank you all for being here. This is an incredible amount of people. I wasn't expecting so many, and it's great to see all of your faces here tonight. And I want to say a very special thank you to Professor Kato for inviting me tonight, and for everyone here at Tsuru University for making this a really great experience for me so far. And I hope tonight that this will be an interesting presentation for you. I thank you for listening to my English. I'll try to speak, slowly and clearly. I know it's hard, to listen to a lecture in a foreign language. So thank you all for doing that work tonight. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about this topic here, fiction across borders. And whoever drew this, bravo, that's incredible, thank you so much. That's really cool. But yeah, this is what I'm going to talk about tonight. Learning from literature in Japan and the US, right, these two different countries. What happens when we cross borders with literature? So I'm going to start tonight with this question. Why literature? And I think when a lot of you here probably study literature, you have at least taken literature classes. And usually when we start a class in English literature or French literature or Japanese literature, we just jump right into the text, right? We start reading a story or a poem. And frequently we don't have a chance to think about these big questions about why are we reading literature in the first place? And Professor Kato kindly said, when we were talking about this speech, you can talk about your experiences, think about literature broadly. And so I decided to do that, right? Instead of talking about my research, which is quite specific and detailed, I thought this is a great chance to think with all of you about this big question about why study literature in the first place. So to begin to think about this question, first I think it's important to think about, well, what do we mean by literature in the first place? This may seem like an obvious question, right? I mean, if you think of what is literature, you think of novels, you think of poetry, maybe drama, right? Theater might come in here. But I want to suggest to you tonight that literature can be even broader. I think about literature as any type of story, right? And that's a pretty big definition because stories surround us, right? We are always living with stories. Whenever you meet your friend for coffee, you tell stories to each other, right? And I think that if we think about literature as just stories, we see that literature is really kind of everywhere, right? There's lots of different types of stories that we are surrounded with. And of course, because there are different types, I think that we can't say that all stories are the same. For example, we have novels, right, which is a very specific type of literature. If you compare that to, say, social media, where we're telling stories about our lives, of course the format is different, the length is different, the content might be a little bit different, right? But at the same time, all of these things they work in the same way, right? They're still stories. And over time, the value of different types of stories has changed socially, right? Today, when we think of literature, we think of novels usually, but 300 years ago, novels were actually critiqued for being kind of too simple, right? When they were first introduced and kind of the genre became popular in Europe, the novel was not seen as a good thing. It was seen as too romantic or too not very serious, right? Or if we think about the Japanese context, in the Edo period, people were writing stories, of course, right? Maybe some of you have. In my classes in New York City, we read Saikaku, right? He writes really interesting stories. They're great. But in the modern period in Japan, those stories were not considered novels, and thus they weren't given as much value, right, by the people who were talking about literature in the Meiji period. So I just want to point out that the value of different types of stories changes over time, right? And I think that probably in 100 years, things will change again. Even today, in America, a lot of universities teach classes on video games, right? And video games as a type of storytelling. A lot of people wouldn't think of video games as literature, but maybe they are, right? Maybe they also have value. So things change, and that's why I think that we can say literature is quite broad, right? It refers to lots of different types of stories, right? So that's my first kind of point that I want to think about tonight with you guys. But yeah, as we think about why literature, why study literature, I think it's also important for us to think about why study foreign literature. You guys right now are again listening to English, not your native language. It's a foreign language for probably most of you, maybe not everyone. Why do we go to that much trouble? Why do we put so much energy in to study another language and learn the literature of another culture? I have studied Japanese for 20 years now. And I've studied Japanese literature for around that much time, 18 years maybe. And even for me, today, reading a Japanese novel takes a lot longer than for a native Japanese speaker, right? And slowly, over the years, it's gotten faster, but it's still harder for me to read And I suspect that's true for many of you here. It's hard to read a novel in French or in English, so why do we go to that trouble? So I'm going to try to answer these questions tonight for you. I'm going to suggest some possible answers. I have three theses, three answers to this question. And the first is that literature helps us to cross borders. Right? You can kind of imagine that this will be especially an answer to the third point of why foreign literature, right? But first I should define what I mean by borders. Of course, a border can be a national border. That may be the first thing that comes to mind. So, if you go out, if I drive in America south far enough, of course, I'll reach the Mexican border, right? So these borders can be physical, but what I want to talk about mostly today is the borders in our minds. Right? These kind of imagined borders. For example, the border that separates one culture from another. Right? Imagined borders are just as real as a physical one, because they do impact our lives. Right? Culture is an incredibly powerful thing. And I, of course, all of you guys know that it structures our life. The culture that we are raised in determines so much about us. But I want to suggest to you that really literature can help us to cross those borders as well. And it has a special capacity to do that. So to kind of give some evidence for this thesis, I'm going to first give some examples from my personal life, my life story. And then later on in this talk, I'll talk about some of my classes that I teach in New York City. And hopefully I can kind of, convince you that literature helps us to cross borders. All right, so this is my story. This is my life story in 3 pictures. The first picture here on the left is from Texas. And Professor Kato kindly mentioned that I am from a very kind of deserty part of Texas. I know she actually visited Texas last summer. And I'm from this part, Texas itself is huge. I think it's bigger than Japan. It's massive. But I'm from this part where it's very deserty. And if you watch, a Western movie, you can probably see this type of landscape, right? There's cowboys on horses riding around in the desert. And that's exactly where I grew up, right? You may also, some of you may recognize this little plant here. It's a real thing. It's called a tumbleweed. When I was growing up, we would always hit these in our car when they're flying across the road, and it's really, some of them are like this big. It's kind of scary. So this is where I grew up, right? It's very different from Tsuru. And it's, to me, coming to Tsuru and seeing these mountains is, a totally different landscape than the type of landscape that I grew up. So I was born in Texas, and growing up, my life was quite different from it is now. The culture that I grew up in was very different even from the New York culture that I live in today. Texas is a very conservative place. It's a very religious place. I believe I heard a statistic that there are more churches in my hometown than fast food restaurants. I mean, it's an incredible number of churches. Basically every corner there's a different church. It's a very religious, very conservative place. And I grew up, of course, in that culture. I grew up feeling, I was very patriotic. I loved America. I was very conservative. I grew up, religious. And various things in my life changed that slowly. The biggest one that I want to talk about tonight is something that happened in 2001, in September 11th, right? You guys probably know on September 11th, there was a big terrorist attack on New York. I was 15 in 2001. So I was in middle school when this happened. And it really changed my life in a very dramatic way. After the attack happened and the Twin Towers were destroyed by this airplane. In my little desert town, people became extremely afraid. The people around me were saying, the terrorists are gonna attack our town, you know. Every time an airplane flew over, people were so afraid. And you know, even as a 15-year-old, I thought, I don't think they're gonna attack us here. There's not a lot of value there. But there was so much fear after 9/11 around me. And very quickly, that fear turned into anger. People began to be so angry at Muslims. Right? Again, I mentioned this is a very conservative and religious place. And so many of the people around me began to sort of tell stories about Muslim people or about Middle Eastern people. And very quickly, this kind of militaristic, patriotic feeling became extremely common in my town. This affected me very personally because at the time my best friend was Middle Eastern. His mom was Turkish, his dad was Egyptian, so you know, not exactly Arabic. But it didn't matter because after the attack on September 11th, my friend began to be targeted by racist people. So, you know, he would be walking his dog at night, and 4 separate times he was attacked by people. A group of men would drive up in those big American trucks that you've probably seen. They're like tanks, and they would get out and beat him because he looked Arabic. He looked like a Middle Eastern. And the story that they told themselves was that Middle Easterners are dangerous and they're terrorists. And so he was attacked like this. And you know, I was not, right? I didn't suffer any violence, but for me, listening to my friend's story, going through this experience with him as his friend, it made me really, really hate Texas, right? I wanted to get out so badly because I thought, you know, these people are all racist and they're all, you know, horrible people. And so this was kind of a turning point for me, right? I mean, I had become so kind of disgusted with Texas and I wanted to escape. And the way that I escaped was watching anime. Okay? So this is, now you see the reason why this line goes here. You know, it may seem like kind of a jump, but even in 2001, in Lubbock, Texas, where I grew up, you could turn on the TV and watch Dragon Ball Z every day after school, right? So, you know, it was around this time when I started to get really interested in anime, because I was seeking an escape. I wanted out of this place, and anime offered a completely different world for me, right? I mean, a lot of these stories are kind of fantastic, but Japan itself became a kind of different world that I could escape into. Right? And I want to suggest that is the power of a story, right? A story can be an escape. It can help you to imagine a different world from the one you live in, right? And that is an incredible, you know, thing that stories can do, and it's something we should definitely think about. In my case, it actually changed my physical life as well, because as I became more and more interested in Japan, I started to study the language a little bit. Since I mentioned that I went to Texas Tech University for a couple of years, and I found a scholarship that would allow me to go to Japan and to study Japanese and then go to a university in Japan, graduate as an undergraduate. And for me at this time, living here, you know, that seemed like a miracle. I was so, you know, kind of just shocked that this even existed. But it seemed like, you know, a helicopter was going to fly to this little town and pick me up and take me somewhere else, right? So of course I applied. I thought this is incredible. My mom was not so happy that I was going to go to some random country that she'd like never heard about. I remember once after I moved to Japan, she asked, "Do people eat ice cream in Japan?" And I just, "Yes, Mom, people eat ice cream in Japan." Anyways, so I went to Japan and I went to study Japanese for a year. I went to the University of Tokyo for 4 years and studied there. And you know, Japan, of course, in my mind until then had been kind of a fantasy. As I mentioned, it felt like a different world to me, right? But of course, as I lived in Japan, as I study and I read more stories, right, from Japan, this, it begins to feel less like a different world and just like the world, right? And I think probably many of you have had that experience as well. Whenever if you guys have studied abroad or if you have visited other countries, that's an experience that's very common. But what I want to emphasize here is that, stories have such a potential to shape our lives, don't they? Whenever we are, deciding who we want to be as people, what kind of work we want to do, what kind of people we want to be, stories are so important. Right? They have the power to shape, where we go in our lives. So, from this story, from my life story, right, my kind of autobiography, we can see a couple of ways that literature can sort of impact us. In my case, this studying literature has, first of all, given me a love of language and translation. When I was first studying Japanese, I would get an English version of a book that I liked, and a Japanese version, translation of it, and read both of them together. Maybe some of you do study in that way as well, right? For me, that was the most fun way to study. I tell my students to study like that. I teach Japanese as well, and most of them do not study like that. But they may watch anime and read subtitles, it's a similar kind of thing. But I think one thing that type of study does is it teaches us about how language works, right? It teaches that language is so connected to our cultures as well. When we speak a language, if we just plug it into Google Translate, you can get some things, but Google does not understand culture, right? And when you read a very good translation, the thing that makes it special is that the translator totally understands both cultures, right? Literature is a way to, or translation is a way to bridge two very different cultures. This is something that I kind of fell in love with as a kid, and maybe some of you have also had that experience of finding a good translation and understanding, wow, this is an incredible piece of work, right? And then maybe some of you have also realized that translation is, again, a way to bridge two very different cultures. For me, right, growing up in the US, reading literature in translation was one way that I was able to understand that although Japanese culture is very different than American culture in many ways, right? And of course, we all know, like I grew up eating with a fork, and you guys grew up eating with maybe chopsticks. Like these are real differences. And yet at the same time, like those are really just very minor things. When you understand that, that cultures can be translated, that if you understand how both cultures work at a deep level, you can kind of make a perfect translation. I think that can teach us that actually these cultures they're not actually as far apart as they seem. So when I was a kid watching anime, and this was like a foreign world to me, it seemed like a different world, like a different planet almost. That was not actually how it is. In reality, although cultural differences are important, people are just people. Humans are humans. And although we have some different behaviors and beliefs, at a core level, we can translate, we can communicate. So I think that's something that, that I learned from my experiences studying literature in both America and Japan. And that's really my third point. When we read the literature of a foreign culture in particular, we learn not to stereotype or to exotify. Again, we learn that that a different culture is not a different species, right? We're all just the same people. Okay? And I think that's something that was very important for me to learn. And it's something that I always try to teach my students, because 95% of my students in New York City take my classes because they love like passionately. They will talk about anime for hours, and just stop them. there's something very powerful about those stories, about Japanese anime and manga. The storytelling, something about it is very powerful. But I think part of the power comes from, again, this kind of exoticness, right? My students also have things that they want to run away from, right? They don't have 9/11, I mean, they were all born after 9/11, but as probably many of you were, but you know, they have things they want to escape from in their lives. And a good story can offer that escape. But if you go deeper, I think it can also offer a deeper truth about the fact that, you know, really people are all the same everywhere you go. Okay. So that is my first thesis about literature helping us cross borders. My second thesis is similar. But I want to talk about a different type of border. Okay? So my second thesis is that literature teaches us how stories can either separate people or empower people. I talked about one type of story that separates us, and that's culture, right? When we're young, we think culture makes people extremely different. That's a story that we learn, but actually maybe it's not so true, right? That's my first thesis. But there are also other types of stories which separate people into different boxes, right? And I think it's, you know, if we think about these things as stories, I think we can start to understand how they work in our lives. Gender, race, class, and various other, related things, they function like stories, just like this story about culture did for me, right? So, what do I mean by this? When I was watching this shonen anime as a kid, you guys have probably had this experience too, there's a very clear story that those shows tell about gender. They tell us a very specific story about how boys should act and how girls should act. It's kind of maybe obvious to you, but in those stories, boys are strong and they protect girls. And girls need protection, right? Basically. There's some exceptions, which is good. But it's a pretty clear gender stereotype that is part of those stories. Even growing up, right? If we think about stories, again, literature is a broad thing. Your parents tell you stories as well about how boys should act and how girls should act. Right? That's a type of story that has a very real impact on us all. Right? Although, again, this is a kind of story that is, it's not a physical border. It still shapes our lives. Right? It changes how we all act. And that's important. However, these stories have changed over time, right? The story that my parents, very conservative parents, told about gender is different from the story that feminists tell about gender, right? And that has changed over time. Gradually, it's okay for girls to wear pants, right? That's now part of the story about what it means to be a girl. You can choose to dress more masculinely. That story of gender has changed over time. And I think that shows us that, my second point here, right? That stories, although they can separate us into different boxes, for example, they can separate boys and girls into different boxes, right? We also have the ability to choose which story we follow or want to believe. We can choose to believe the story of feminism that says girls can do whatever they want. They can be strong and they can be, they can protect the boys rather than the story that the shonen tell us, right? So that's something that I think is really important to remember, right? Although stories can separate people, they also can empower us. They can, give us a new way to live. This is similar to how, when I was young, I decided, the power of stories helped me decide a new type of life path, right? And maybe that's true for some of you as well. Maybe some of you saw a TV show or read a book that changed your life. And that's what I mean here, right? Stories can be incredibly empowering, even if they can also sometimes separate us. race is also an example of a story that can separate. Right now in the US, the election is coming, the presidential election. And one of the presidential candidates, Trump, tells lots of stories about race. Right? I mean, these are stories that I heard, similar stories to what I heard after 9/11, right, about brown people being scary. This is a very powerful story that we hear in America, unfortunately, all the time, because it's always on the news. But you know, it's very powerful, right? Trump won the presidential election because of the power of those stories. He will every time he talks, he will tell stories about how immigrants and people who are brown-skinned are dangerous, right? That he'll say that immigrants come into America and murder and rape people, that they're scary. And for me, when I see that, of course it does. It brings out these memories of 9/11 and the violence that I saw happen against my friend, just purely because of what he looked like. So in that way, race in particular is a story that separates people into different boxes. And yet, at the same time, we can choose to believe in a different story. Right? We can choose to believe in the story that I was telling a second ago, which is that really people are just people, no matter what they look like. No matter what skin color they have or what culture they have as well. But yeah, I mean, I think I try to focus on both of these a lot in my classes. If you guys took the COIL, some of you I'm sure were in COIL with me, and race is a big part of those stories about World War II as well. Right? And so when I teach my students about the war and about even the pre-war period in Japanese history, we talk a lot about race, about how the Japanese writers and films that we're looking at in class, how they depict, for example, Koreans or Taiwanese people that are non-Japanese. But we also think about how Japanese people in that time period experienced racism from the West as well. The kinds of stories they heard about how Americans thought about Japanese people. And seeing that these different ideas about race and racism, different types of racism, I think can be very powerful. It can help us understand how these stories have so much power. Class is another type of story, right? Like the stories we hear about why some people are rich and some people are poor, right? How we need to think very critically about how those stories separate us into different boxes. Okay. So, in the remainder of my time, I'm going to give you some examples from my classes that I teach in the US. And just talk a little bit about how the stories that we read in those classes supports this point, right? How I try to teach this point to my students in class. So these are just a selection of some of the one book and 2 films that I show to my students in the lab. The first one here is called Konbini Ningen, right? Or in English it's Convenience Store Woman. How many of you have read this book? Quite a few. That's great. That's great. It's by Murata Sayaka. It's a really wonderful book. It's a great translation as well in English. If you guys are looking for a book to read in English and Japanese together, great. Excuse me. This book is a way for me to talk about what is called neurodivergence. How many of you have heard this word, neurodivergence? Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's quite rare because it's a very new word in English. It just was created probably 20 years ago or so. The roots, if you to teach some English today, the roots neuro means your nerves, right? Your shinke, your brain. Divergence means to diverge, right? To if you're going one direction and then you go a different direction, right? It means basically difference of some type. So neurodivergence is a new word to basically talk about people whose brains are different. Right? Their nerves are different in some way. That, you know, in another way to say this word is maybe mentally disabled or some sort of mental disability or disorder, right? But those words have a negative connotation. Disorder and disability are negative, whereas divergence means just a different path, difference. Okay. So this book, this is another type of story which I haven't talked about yet, right? The story about what it means to be normal, what it means to have a normal brain, right? The main character in the story, we never learn exactly, you know, how she's neurodivergent, but we can assume that she has autism. Autism, if you don't know, is jiheisho in Japanese, right? I mean, she's on, this is difficult as well because autism is a spectrum. Some people have very serious, you know, differences, and some people have less serious differences. The character in this book has a relatively light autism, basically, we can assume. She never goes to a doctor and gets a diagnosis, but that's what we can kind of guess. We can guess this because as a child, she was always different from her friends. Right? She never understood why her friends did what they did. She understood the world very differently, and she felt like, you know, somehow everyone was acting very weirdly all the time. And from the time she was a child, you know, people made her feel like she was the one that was different and strange, right? Her teachers, her mom, her friends all kind of made her feel different. And she lived with that feeling until one day she begins to work at the convenience store, right? When I teach this book, by the way, I always show videos of Japanese convenience stores to my students, and they're all just blown away, right? Because it's very different in the United States. But the convenience store setting in Japan, because it is quite special, is really wonderful for her. She loves working there because it gives her a manual for life. She knows that as long as she follows the training guide of the convenience store she works at, she'll be okay, and people will accept her as normal. As long as she says, you know, "Irashaimase" when she walks in and, you know, follows all the steps, it'll be fine. And she talks about how she wishes she had a manual like that for the rest of her life, right? Sadly, as the book goes on, I don't want to spoil the plot for if you haven't read it, but basically her coworkers begin to pressure her to be normal in other ways. In particular, they think that she should get married, she should, you know, fall in love, have kids, do the things that women are supposed to do. But the main character has no interest in that, right? She just wants to live her life that she's found a lot of happiness in. And so that's the main tension of the book, right? This, I think, is a really, really excellent book for talking about how society pressures people to be normal and what that really means. Being normal is a certain type of story, right? It's a story about how women should, you know, get married and have kids. It's a story about how people should always want to improve their career, right? People think she's strange because she just wants to work as a convenience store clerk. They think she should try to get a different job, right? But those things, you know, those stories don't, for her, they seem horrible. Right? And so she pushes back and she doesn't want to conform to this. So this is one way that we talk about, again, these stories in society and the power that they have on real people. And yeah, I think a lot of my students really relate to this book because in various ways, there's all sorts of stories that we hear from society that don't feel good for us. Right? Whether or not you're neurodivergent or whatever, you know, there's some things that don't make sense to us. There's this kind of pressure from society. And being able to think about it from this perspective is really good for my students. Okay, number 2 here, Kimi no Nawa, or in English, it's just your name. How many of you have seen this film? That's much higher response rate. I thought that might be the case. How many of you like this film? If you saw it, I saw a lot of people who people are nervous to raise their hand. I know. I'm not going to call on you. It's okay. Don't worry. Yeah, so my students absolutely love this film. They find it really moving. Some of them talk about how they cried when they watched it. Right? And that's true actually for all of this director's films. Shinkai Makoto is the director. He makes films that my students just absolutely love. Right? I think part of that, probably part of the reason why they love it so much, is because his worlds do offer a type of escape, right? They're so beautiful, for one thing. There's nothing ugly in his films, ever. Everything is beautiful and clean and colorful, right? And for my students in particular, the worlds that he shows, they are very exotic, right? It's either Tokyo, in this film, it's Tokyo and the countryside in Japan, both of which are very, very different from New York City, where my students grew, almost all my students grew up and live. So, it's a very powerful film for them to watch. And as we discuss it, it's very interesting for my students. Gender got kind of cut off, but we talk mostly about this film from the perspective of gender. If you haven't watched, most of you watched the film, but just if you haven't, these two characters, there's a boy and a girl, and they switch bodies, basically. In the morning, they wake up sometimes, and they are in the other person's body, right? So the boy wakes up as a girl, the girl wakes up as a boy, and they live one day, and then they switch back. In the end, I don't have to worry about spoiling it because 99% of you have seen it. Right, in the end, they fall in love, and there's a lot of drama, and then they fall in love, and eventually get back together. Right, they probably have a relationship. They meet in real life, and so it's a touching kind of romance, which is very popular. It's also a type of fantasy, right? This kind of true love is definitely a story that has a lot of power for us. But I always try to focus especially on this idea of gender, right? Because these two characters, when they switch bodies, they have a lot of fun, right? I think that is also a type of fantasy for many people. People who don't feel totally in love with what it means to be a boy or a girl. This kind of experience, there's some appeal to that. What would it be like to spend a day as a girl or as a boy, right? There's something kind of interesting about that. I mean, this is a genre of film which actually has a long history. There's a lot of gender swap films and stories. So there's something in there, right? There's some reason why this is an interesting fantasy. One thing that I tell my students is that this film, I think, shows us in some ways that when your body swaps and people see you as the other gender, it's quite easy to just perform that, right? Gender is not so, solid and set in stone, right, as it may seem. It's actually quite easy to just perform a different gender, as long as people see you as that gender, right? There's not much friction. There's some, like whenever the boy is in her body, he forgets to cross his legs, right? And so the friends of the girl tell her, oh, you gotta be careful, people are gonna see up your skirt. These are things that a boy wouldn't know, right? So we see partly how society trains girls to be careful about what they look like for boys, right? But there's this kind of flexibility in gender in this film that I think tells us about how this story of gender works. It tells us how, when we perform a certain way, we are that gender in some ways. So in some ways, it's a kind of radical message about gender. It's kind of, in some ways, a feminist message that you can be transgender in a way, or you can change your gender, and that's fine. But at the same time, there's also a kind of more conservative message, because at the end of the film, they go back to their original bodies, and that's the way that they become happy. Right? This is not a film about people who switch genders and want to stay that way. It's just about a kind of gender play. Right? So that's what I try to tell my students. Right? That there is a kind of radical story here, but in the end, that radicalness is sort of taken away. Okay, and third film here, which I watched in class, is called Hafu. It's one of the films that I show when I talk about race, right? Especially in the Japanese context. How many of you have seen this film? It's a documentary film. Okay, yeah, it's about, I would say 10 or 20 years old now. I don't think it had a really huge, theatrical release, but it's a great film. It talks about the experience of being, mixed race. Mixed race is the word in English that people use mostly. They use that word because the word half implies that you're not full of something, right? It's kind of, it has a bit of a negative connotation for something. So, this film is about mixed race people living in Japan. And it's always very interesting for my students to think about how race works in Japan. Because they grew up in New York City, and New York City is incredibly diverse. It's always, especially where I live in Queens, which is part of New York City, where each train station is like going to a different country, right? If you get off one station, you're in India, and if you get off at the next station, you're in South America. There's so many different ethnic communities living right next to each other. And so my students all went to school surrounded by people from different cultures, and people of different races and different skin colors, right? So for them, the experience of race is so different. Also, America, as you all know, has a big racism problem, right? And people are, especially my students who are black, who are not white, have all experienced racism as well, even though it's a very diverse place. So for them, that context is what they know. And when they see examples of how race is talked about and how racism works in Japan, it's very surprising for them. That, again, it kind of, one thing that watching this film does is it shows them that Japan is not necessarily the type of country they see in animes like this, right? There are people that do not look like these characters who live in Japan. And they have a very different type of experience because of their race. Right? So in some ways it complicates the stories that they know about Japan, but it also helps them think about how race works as a story in different places. And that's a very different type of thing, right, in different countries. All right. So finally, I have a third thesis, but really it's just kind of an extension of the other two. Okay? There's nothing really new here. Literature helps us to understand society. Basically, that's what I've been saying this whole time. But also history, right? And I just wanted to add this because it is an important thing to think about. When we learn about history, I think that one of the best ways to do that is through stories, right? If you read a history book, sadly, it tends to be pretty boring. You have to memorize dates, and you have to memorize numbers, and that's fine. I think that's important in some ways, but history is just stories, right? And it's stories that happen to real people. And I think that by learning history through film or through stories, it could be a novel or any other type of story, it helps my students so much to understand that this history happened to real people. Right? So I just have a couple of examples here of films that I recommend to you guys. If you want to learn, think about history from the perspective of real people. These are just some of my kind of favorites that I show in class to talk about World War II. And they're also films that we didn't watch for COIL. So if you took my COIL class and you want some more recommendations, we already had a lot of films in that class, but yeah, these are two recommendations. Right? So the first is Nihon no Ichiban Nagai Hi, or Japan's Longest Day in English. And it tells the story of how the war ended in Japan. Right? How many of you have seen this film? Anyone else? So it's great. It's old and black and white, but it's so good because it really shows you the psychology of the leaders of Japan in 1945, right? And that's something that I think it's so important for all of us to think about. How do rational, smart people end up fighting a war for all these years, even though they knew they would lose, right? How did they have this kind of insane, I don't want to use that word, but incredible loyalty in the emperor and in their country, even though the atomic bombs had been dropped and Japan had lost so many battles, right? That psychology is very human. I think it can happen to anybody. I mean, we all have, again, these human qualities. And so, again, I really recommend this film. This film is Yuki Deshingun, or in Japanese, or in English, it's a very different title. It's the English title is The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On. This is a great film. It's very kind of shocking to watch, but it tells the story of a soldier who came home from the war, and then about, I think, 10 or 20 years later, decides to go and interview the people that were in his unit who fought with him in New Guinea, which, as if you know about the World War II history, New Guinea is a really scary place. There was cannibalism, people were eating other people, right? It was an absolutely horrible place. And so he goes around and interviews people and kind of forces them to talk about that history. He forces them sometimes by punching them, right? Like he goes up to old men who had fought in World War II, and he sometimes will attack them and say, you have to talk about this. But it works, and he gets this sort of truth about what happened to his unit, and how people had to become cannibals to survive, and just really incredible history. So again, putting a human face on, if we hear the history in a textbook about cannibalism happened in the war, it doesn't, it's scary, but once you see how it affects these men emotionally, I think it adds a whole nother dimension to that history. It makes it a story that is, again, has real people in it, rather than just in one group. And, of course, I just wanted to mention again that I think the COIL collaboration that Professor Kato very kindly worked very hard with me to plan and organize was a really great way for us to use stories to cross borders, right? To learn about history and about society, but also to connect with each other, right? So I hope it was a good experience for those of you who participated, and it certainly was good for me. But there are other opportunities to collaborate with people, across borders that I recommend. So, to return to my beginning question, I hope that I have kind of showed some ideas that I have, and I hope they've been interesting to you, about how literature helps us to cross borders. It helps us to see how all sorts of stories influence us, but then how we can also choose our own stories, right? And it also teaches us very important things about society and history. So I think that's all. If you have any questions, of course, I'm very glad to talk about these topics with you. Feel free to ask in Japanese. I do speak Japanese, so if you, Professor Kato was very kind to say that I could speak in English today. I was kind of worried. I'm like, oh God, I could speak for an hour in Japanese. But yeah, please feel free to ask any questions you'd like in Japanese. And yeah, that's all. Thank you so much for coming today.
ありがとうございました。それでは質疑応答に入らさせていただきます。質問のある方は挙手をお願いします。
日本語で、
はい、
内容に直接関わりがあるかどうかわからないんですけど、一番最初に聞いた日本のアニメを教えてください。
にアメリカのテレビでやってたのは多分、私の記憶の中ではドラゴンボールだと思います。もうちょっと若い世代だったらポケモンはやってたんですけど、私は15、7ぐらいになった時にもうポケモンが報道されたんです。ドラゴンボールはすごい早くアメリカに入っている。でも実はその前から私の兄がなんかアニメのクラブ、多分高校とかのアニメのクラブに入っていて、当時なんかレーザーディスクっていうのがあったんですけど、レーザーディスクっていう、はい、なんかすごいなんか CD ロムとか DVD みたいな感じですけど、すごいでかいんですね。そういうレーザーディスクを輸入して自分たちでなんかパソコンもない時代だったんですけど、どうにかして字幕を入れて見てたんです。だからお兄さんは結構若い頃からいろんなアニメに触れて、その話を聞いてたんですけど、そうですね、はい、それもはい、ありがとうございます。
時間の関係で質疑応答はこちら最後となります。そして質問がある方はその閉会後、ジョシュア先生に直接お聞きください。ジョシュア先生、本日は素晴らしい講演をありがとうございました。もう一度ジョシュア先生、ここで鶴文化大学加藤ゼミ生、三宅さん、江田さんから花束贈呈がございます。よろしくお願いします。
本日はニューヨークからこれまでお越しいただいてありがとうございます。これからの私たちの周りにつながるような新しくその文学というものを捉え直そうという気を起こさせるような大変興味深い演でした。ありがとうございます。こちらのお写真です。お選びください。はい、ありがとうございます。
最後に会場の皆様にアンケートの協力のお願いがございます。前にある QR コードを読み取っていただき、アンケートの回答をお願いします。本日はご多忙の中、鶴文化大学加藤ゼミ英文学会共催の特別講演会に足をお運びいただきありがとうございました。以上をもちまして、鶴文化大学加藤ゼミ英文学会共催の特別講演会を閉会いたします。ありがとうございました。それではアンケートが終わり次第、
終わり次第、みんなアンケート答えないと、
すみません、なんかないです。後ろの方に
カメラ切って。